Hey there, friends, and welcome to another edition in the Geology 101 Physical Geology video series. I'm Geology Professor Shawn Willsey. Today we're going to be looking at faults. This is episode 27 in this video series. This video series is based on my college courses here teaching physical geology. It's the same curriculum, the same content and topics. The only thing missing, of course, are the field trips and the lab components, but you can supplement those with some of my other videos. So this is another video looking at the sequence we've been doing the last several episodes, looking at rock deformation. And today what we'll be looking at is the manifestation of brittle deformation. When rocks break under stress, they tend to produce movement across the rock surface, and that's called a fault. In subsequent episodes, we'll look at earthquakes, which are the manifestation of faults moving and breaking, kind of the human experience involved. But today we're going to be looking at faults. We're going to be looking at ways in which faults can be classified and categorized. And so let's just go ahead and get right to it here. So the first thing is a fault is a fracture with movement on either side. Basically, stress builds up along the rock interface until the rocks fail, and then the rocks shift and move in response to that stress, and that energy is released as an earthquake. And so we have a couple of different faults here, but let's start with my little boxes here. So I've got two simple boxes here with some layers of rock you can see from the side view here, and then here's the top view. And so if we pull away one of these blocks and think about a fault, remember what we've learned about planar rock surfaces. Planar rock surfaces have a strike and a dip. So if we think about this planar rock surface, this fault, it has a strike direction, which runs this way. If a horizontal plane intersects this tilted fault plane, we get a line, and so that defines the strike direction. We also have a dip direction, the direction in which the rock is dipping downwards into the earth, which in this case is in this direction. So if we think about it, if faults have both strike and dip, we might see the fault movement, the movement across the fault, being either in the strike direction, which produces movement like this, horizontal side-to-side motion, or if the movement is in the dip direction, that's going to produce up and down motion across the fault. And so these types of faults are known as either dip-slip faults. So if the fault moves in the dip direction, vertically, up and down, that's what we call a dip-slip fault. And this is what produces mountains. Mountains many times are formed by the iterative movement over usually thousands or millions of years of a fault, which progressively pushes one side up, drops one side down, and eventually produces a big topographic feature or escarpment like with the Teton faults you see here. The other way we can see movement across a fault, I move my box around, is with a strike slip fault. So here the movement is going to be side to side. Now the most important thing we need to know as we start categorizing faults is we need to know which perspective we're looking at. Because if you look at this end on and I move the blocks forwards and backwards, it's a little hard to see the movement. But if I flip it to the overhead view, the map view, and allow the boxes to shift now you can see the displacement or the offset across the box much more easily. So our strike slip faults are going to be best seen from an aerial view, from a map view, and our dip slip faults are going to be best seen from a cross-section view, where the movement is up and down, and we need to observe that movement in a profile or cross-sectional view. Recognize too, of course, that we can have oblique slip faults. So you can have movement where the fault is moving both side to side and there's a horizontal component of motion as well. Let me see if I can turn that so you can see that kind of end on. You can see that the two blocks have moved both sideways and in an up and down motion as well. We won't do much with the the oblique slip faults. We're going to stick to the basic end members here, dip slip faults and strike slip faults. Up here on dip slip faults, I have that can create a fault scarp. So when there's movement on that up and down fault surface, that can produce a little cliff face or a little escarpment right here, and this is known as a fault scarp. Basically, it's where the fault plane breaches the surface, and we typically only see it on fairly large earthquakes. But I want to show you one example from here in Idaho. So here's Bora Peak. Let me get myself smaller now. I don't need to show you any more blocks. That should be good. So here's Boar Peak, the highest point in Idaho, over 12,000 feet, sitting up there in the sky. And if you look at the base of Boar Peak, you'll see this faint little line that runs along the base here. And if you didn't know any better, you'd think it was just, maybe some unimproved gravel road, some access road or something like that. But this is actually the fault scarp. So there was an earthquake here in 1983, around magnitude 7 or so, that actually pushed the mountain up, dropped the valley down. And if you get up close to this fault scarp, this is exactly what it looks like. So there's a picture of me from several years ago looking at the fault scarp itself. It's about maybe 10 feet or 3 meters in height. So you can see this escarpment, this cliff face that was created when this side of the fault was pushed up, that's the mountain side, and it dropped the valley side down. And so there's the fault scarp left behind from that earthquake in 1983. So as we start looking at especially dip slip faults, and we need to figure out the two main types of dip slip faults, there's a critical step we need to take in order to determine fault types, and that is figuring out how to identify the two sides of the fault. And we use this language called footwall and hanging wall. So with a dip slip fault that moves rocks up and down, we're going to need to define those two blocks, those two separate sides of the fault plane. And the terminology comes from miners that used to tunnel down along fault planes, which sometimes are good places where rocks have been pulverized and mineralized, and there can be ore deposits or other valuable commodities. They would hang their lanterns above them on the upside of the fault, the side of the fault that was above them, and that became known as the hanging wall. And then the side below their feet is what became known as the footwall. So in essence, if you look at these dip slip faults, which will typically have, some dip less than 90 degrees, let's say like a 45, 50 degree angle, the area below the fault is what we call the footwall, and the area or the block above it is the hanging wall. Now, students sometimes get a little confused with this, and it takes some time to learn. And so I've devised a few different little strategies here that might be helpful to you. So here I have a cross section of two different faults. Let's start with the rocks themselves. We can see there's a sequence of sedimentary rocks here, layered rocks, that starts with yellow at the bottom and then goes up to the orange layer, which is on top. That's using the principle of superposition. And the first thing we're going to want to do with these faults, which you can see have offset and cut the rocks here and displace them, is figure out which side is the footwall and which side is the hanging wall. And one method I use to help students determine this is I say, okay, just put your pencil or your thumb or your finger right on the fault, okay? And then drop down, drag your pencil or your thumb or your finger down vertically. And in this case, you're in the footwall. So if you look at these in cross-section view, which is the way we have to look at these to see the offset, if you drag your pencil straight down or your finger straight down, that puts you in the footwall. So this whole side of this block here is the footwall of this fault. That would make, of course, the other side of the fault the hanging wall. Down here at the bottom, I have a different diagram, different type of fault, but the principle is still the same. Put your thumb or finger or pencil on the fault plane, okay, which shows up as a line here, and then drag it straight down, and then that becomes the footwall. So notice that even though these sort of look like similar diagrams, the fault planes are oriented differently. This one is dipping down to the right, this one's dipping down to the left, and so that makes the footwall designation a little bit different. This is the side of the fault below the fault, and this over here is the side of the fault below the fault. And that's the definition of what the footwall is. Another way, sometimes that works with students, sometimes it doesn't. So I've worked on a different way of maybe helping them learn this concept. And so another way to do it is to, instead of doing the whole, put your finger on the fault and drag it down sort of thing, is to draw a little stick figure on the fault. And here's my little silly stick figure. And I draw my stick figure so that their feet, their big size 16 sneakers there, are sitting directly on the fault. And that makes the side with their feet the footwall. So this would be the footwall side of the fault. Excuse me. And if I do the same thing with the lower diagram, notice I get my stick figure drawn with them standing right on the fault plane and their big size 15, 16 sneakers here. And so that makes this side of the fault the footwall. So hopefully that's a little bit helpful, because it's absolutely imperative that you can identify footwall and hanging wall in order to determine specifically what kind of dip-slip fault we have. So what are the two different types of dip-slip faults? Well, the first one we have is what are called normal faults. Normal faults are formed by extension. The rocks are being stretched and pulled apart laterally. And in a footwall, or excuse me, in a normal fault, what we end up with is the footwall moving up relative to the hanging wall. Now, a lot of times we don't know which, did the footwall just move up and the hanging wall stayed put, or did the footwall stay put and the hanging wall move down? A lot of times when we talk about this motion, it's relative motion. So relative to the hanging wall, the footwall has moved up, or relative to the footwall, the hanging wall has moved down. And notice here with this block diagram that we might be able to pick a place. It's not totally intuitive that this is caused by extension, but one way that might be helpful is notice we might drill down from this point right here. And if we did so, we would absolutely miss, completely not intersect the green layer that's on either side. So you can imagine as more faulting takes place, not only does this hanging wall side move down, but it's actually moving away, or to the right in this case. And that might help you kind of visualize and see that these are truly caused by extension. These are usually fairly steep faults, but they don't have to be. There's actually low angle normal faults called detachment faults, but we're not going to get into that today. But typically they're like, 45, maybe 60 degrees or so. And then here's a couple examples of these. So like the Wasatch Fault in northern Utah around Salt Lake City, the Teton Fault, which I've shown you before in the Grand Tetons, and then here in Idaho at the base of Bora Peak is that fault that produced the earthquake in 1983, the Lost River Fault. So this is a dip-slip fault where the footwall moves up and the hanging wall moves down. That is what we define as a normal fault. What is the other type of dip-slip fault? It's called a reverse fault. So in a reverse fault, the stress is completely different. We have compression. You can see the two big black arrows there. We're squeezing the rocks together, and that's causing the hanging wall side to be pushed up and over relative to the footwall side. So in this case, we have hanging wall side going up, footwall side going down, opposite of what we saw with a normal fault. Notice now that if we drill down, we might be able to pick a place where instead of missing the green layer, we might intersect it twice. So you can see that this hanging wall side is pushing the rock up and over itself. And there's repetition if you draw a vertical line here up and down. The blue layer is intersected twice over here, green layer, and then this brown or gray layer right here. You might also hear sometimes about thrust faults. Thrust faults are also reverse faults. They're just typically low angle reverse faults, but those are, in terms of the mechanics and the dynamics, those are completely synonymous terms. Okay, so those are the dip-slip faults. And then remember we looked at how the faults behave when they move laterally, side to side. Those are what we call strike-slip faults. So now we're moving the rocks laterally in the direction of strike. So to see that, we need to see it from above. We need to look at it in map view. And so what I've drawn here is, let's say this is a road. Okay, so this is a road that crosses a fault, and at some point the fault has an earthquake and the road gets displaced, and this is what we see after the earthquake is over. So we can see that the road here has been displaced, and the way you want to figure out these types of strike-slip faults is you stand on one side of the fault. So let's say I'm standing over here on this, I guess, below or south side of the fault, and as I stand on the road and look across the fault, in order to see the rest of the road, I have to look to my left. And notice this works no matter what your perspective is. If you come along the road here on the up or north side of the fault, and you stand on one side of the fault looking across the fault, you're going to have to turn your head to the left from that perspective to see the rest of the road. So that makes this a left lateral strike-slip fault. And of course, if we can have left lateral strike-slip faults, we can also have right lateral strike-slip faults. So here's another example, although except in this case, the road has been displaced as we look across the fault to our right. And again, it doesn't matter which side of the fault you stand on. So that's the game we play with strike-slip faults. Stand on one side, look across the fault, and see whatever feature of interest has been displaced look to see which direction it has been displaced relative to your perspective. Left lateral and right lateral strike slip faults. So again, we have two types of dip slip faults, normal and reverse. Two types of strike slip faults, left lateral and right lateral. A couple other fun photos to go with some strike slip faults. Here's actually an example of road being offset by a fault. So you can see the fault kind of cutting across a bit obliquely across this photo here. If you look at the center line of the road, notice as it crosses the fault, if you stand on either side and look across the fault, the movement is to the right. And so this would be a right lateral strike slip fault. Sometimes we see these types of faults when they have earthquakes do crazy things like bend train tracks. So you can see that the railroad tracks here have actually been displaced to the right. So this would be another right lateral strike slip fault that cuts across this rail line here. And then just for fun, here's a sandwich. And the sandwich has been cut in half and displaced. So if you stand on one side of the sandwich, look across to the other side of the sandwich, which way have things moved? And in this case, the movement is to the left. So this sandwich has been cut by a left lateral strike slip fault. So there you go. You can play with your food, make faults, make a mess, but get educated and learn at the same time. How do you feel about that? Pretty good? Let's go ahead and do some quiz questions then and see if you understand the concept. So now I'll be clear, for each one of these little quiz questions, I have to tell you what the view is. This is incredibly important. So in this case, we're in cross-section view. We're looking at a cliff or a profile view of the rocks. The fault of interest runs kind of right through the middle of the photo there, just above the rock hammer. I've labeled one side of the fault with X, the other side of the fault with a Y. And your job is to fill in the blanks there. So go ahead and pause the video if you need to take some time. Okay, let's go ahead and figure this one out. So here's our fault. Remember the game we play? I'm going to put my little pointer here right on the fault, and I'm going to drag my little pointer straight down. That puts me into the footwall. So Y is the footwall. That makes X the hanging wall. There's half of the solution right there. I've identified the hanging wall, which is X, and the footwall, which is Y. The second thing I need to do in order to figure out which side moved up, which side moved down, is I need to find some sort of marker bed, some sort of layer in the rock that I feel good matches up on either side. And for me, this one kind of stands out right here. This layer runs right behind the rock hammer. I can see on this side of the fault, it's right here, but on the other side of the fault is at a higher position. So it appears that on the hanging wall side, that layer has moved up relative to the footwall side where that layer has moved down. So with hanging wall up, footwall down, that defines a reverse fault. So we've got hanging wall, footwall, reverse. So the correct answer there, it looks like, was A. This is a reverse fault. Reverse faults are caused by anyone? Bueller? Compression. How do we know these rocks have been compressed? Well, we have a reverse fault there. Nicely shows up as the overlap there. You can see this layer has been pushed over the top of that one. But another cool thing we have in this photo is we have a fold. We can see that these rock layers, which were originally horizontal, have actually been deformed into a fold. And quite possibly one interpretation here is these rocks were actually bent a little bit until they reached some sort of brittle critical failure point, in which case they broke, and that's how the fault was created here that cuts through the rock layers. So nice example there of a good reverse fault. Let's go on to another example here. Quiz question number 2. Here's the fault running right through the photo. Here's a photo I took in, I think it was on the coast of Oregon many years ago. So you can see the fault here. You are in map view. I took this photo literally looking straight down towards my feet. And so see if you can take a minute here and figure out what kind of fault this is. Go ahead and pause the video if you need to. Okay, so we're in map view, which tells us we're looking at horizontal motion, strike slip motion. And so the idea here is to stand on one side of the fault. I'm going to pick this side over here. Look across the fault. I'm going to stand on these 2 red layers. And as I look across the fault, those 2 red layers are to my left. So that would make this a left lateral strike slip fault. The answer was B. All right, quiz question number 3. This is just outside Arches National Park, looking across the highway. Cross-section view. There's a big road cut there. And it looks like we've got, let's see, 1, 2, at least 3, at least maybe 4 faults, 4 pretty obvious faults. There's one over here, one here, and then another one right there close by. Shouldn't matter which fault you look at here, you should end up with the same answer, but try to figure out what kind of fault we have here. We're playing Name That Fault, the game show that's sweeping the nation. Go ahead and pause the video if you need to. Okay, and we're back. Let's see what kind of fault we have here. So remember, cross-section view tells us we're looking at up-down motion or a dip-slip fault. So I'm going to pick this one over here on the right just for fun because it's nice and clean. And so I can see that the fault is steep, but it does have a dip. Okay, so it is a bit of a ramp. And so that would make this side of the fault, which is our left in this case, the foot wall. And the other side, or the right side in this case, would be the hanging wall. Now I look to see how things have moved. Looks like the foot wall side has moved up. The hanging wall side has moved down. If I come over here to one of these other faults, I can see the same relationship. This gray layer here is the same as this one over here. This is the hanging wall side, which has dropped down. The foot wall side, which has been pushed up. So that would make this a normal fault. The answer was C. All right, quiz question number 4, moving on. This was also a photo I took, I think it was the same trip. This was also at Arches National Park on, I think, the Wall Street hike. But we have several faults cutting through this very fine-grained or medium-grained sandstone with all these fine layers in it. So you can see a fault going up and down on the screen here, another one here, another one here, and a fourth one over here. We are in map view, so we're looking straight down at the rock. So go ahead and pause the video if you need a second to figure this one out. Okay, so we're in map view, so we're looking at horizontal movement. The movement is horizontal or strike slip. The game is the same. We stand on one side of the fault. I'll stand on this side. Look across. I'll look across this fault here, and this dark layer I'm standing on here has been shifted to my left. So this is a left lateral strike slip fault. Same with this one, same with this one, same with this one. So we have a series of left lateral strike slip faults, little kind of micro faults here in this area. Okay, let's do another one. Next quiz question. Here we are in Death Valley. Here's one of my former students. The fault runs just behind her and kind of cuts through here. This is one of the most photographed faults around, I suppose. You see this in a lot of intro geology textbooks. So go ahead and pause the video and take a second to answer this question. Alrighty, so we have 2 blanks to fill in. We need to figure out if Carly's standing on the hanging wall or the foot wall. There's our fault. So let's put our pointer or our pencil right on the fault, drag it down, and that would put us in the foot wall. Or if you need to draw a little stick figure, their feet would be sitting on this side of the fault, which would be the foot wall. So Carly is clearly standing on the foot wall side of the fault. Next thing we need to do is see how things have been displaced, which sides moved up, which sides moved down. Probably the easiest thing here is this red layer. You can see it on this side of the fault, and then just over here on this side of the fault. So clearly the foot wall side appears to have moved up relative to the hanging wall side. Foot wall up, hanging wall down is what we define as a normal fault. So hanging wall, or excuse me, foot wall and normal, that would make the answer D. So this one was D. All right, and I think this is my last one here. So here we have, this was also in Oregon on a field trip many years ago. The fault runs right across the view here from left to right. And this gentleman, his left foot is standing on this rib of rock. And the same rib of rock is over here under his right foot. So the offset here, we are in map view, cuts across this way. This little mound of rock here similarly is the same as the one over here. So a little bit different here because it's kind of an oblique view, but essentially it is a map view. You're looking down on the ground. So go ahead and pause the video and see if you can figure that one out. Okay, so we have the fault cutting across the photo here. If I stand on, let's say, this rib of rock here, look across the fault, where is that rib of rock now? Excuse me, it's to my right. So that would make this a right lateral strike slip fault, or in other words, the answer was D. How'd you do on that one there, team? Hopefully you did okay. Awesome. Well, those were our quiz questions for this episode. Hopefully you enjoyed learning a little bit about faults. I know a lot of viewers sometimes get confused with the terminology and is this a normal fault, a reverse fault, strike slip? But hopefully this video shed some light on that. Might need to watch it a few times if you missed a few things. Please leave any questions you have in the comments. Appreciate your support of the channel. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Take care.